much the same as what would have been presented in May had the House not been dissolved. I will get to the differences later, but first, Mr. Speaker, let me run through the similarities. This Financial Measures Act amends a number of laws to implement previously announced increases to legislated fees and government charges, such as those for personal property security registrations, summary proceedings, and corporation registration. Those were decisions made by the previous government. Amendments in this Act will also defer the transit tax credit, as well as the extension of the healthy living tax credit to adults, just as the previous government had planned. In addition, Mr. Speaker, amendments to the Revenue Act will provide for the tobacco tax rate increase, which was implemented on June 22nd. That, too, was a decision made by the previous government. Changes to the Public Service Superannuation Act will support increased contributions to the Public Service Superannuation Fund, and that was implemented in July. The increase is needed to improve the financial health of the plan. That was a decision made by the previous government. Finally, Mr. Speaker, in speaking of the similarities, the House of Assembly Act will be amended to freeze indemnity and salary increases for 2010 and 2011 for all MLAs, as well as for the additional amounts paid to the Speaker, Deputy Speaker, Leader of the Opposition, Leader of the Third Party, and members of the Executive Council. That was a decision made by the previous government. All of those matters, Mr. Speaker, we have adopted because the budget we presented on September 24th is substantially the same as the one presented on May the 4th. Mr. Speaker, let me now turn to the differences. I would like to begin by talking about the proposed amendments in this bill that are proposed to the Provincial Finance Act. In order to reflect the reality of the financial circumstances we are faced with today, we are making 3 changes to the Provincial Finance Act. First, government will be allowed to table a deficit budget. Second, revenues from the offshore offset will be able to be spent on programs and services. And third, government will no longer be required to recover a deficit in the following year. Mr. Speaker, balanced budget laws were passed across the country when times were easier. When the current recession hit and times became much tougher, those balanced budget laws have been amended, suspended, or repealed across the country. Nova Scotia is not immune from those economic forces. Mr. Speaker, let us have no illusions about the state of the province's finances. The budget presented on September the 24th and this Financial Measures Act present a more accurate picture of the finances than the previous government presented. For example, Mr. Speaker, the previous government enjoyed revenue growth averaging 5% per year over its 10 years in office. And Mr. Speaker, it spent every penny of that revenue growth. And Mr. Speaker, it went beyond that and made commitments to spend even more money in the future, money that that government did not have. Now, Mr. Speaker, the province's revenue is actually dropping. Even between May 4th and September 24th, the revenue forecast dropped by $125 million. The province's revenues are not expected to recover for at least 2 years. And even when there is a recovery, revenue growth is expected to grow at a much more modest rate than the 5% per year enjoyed by the previous government. Mr. Speaker, the previous government also failed to budget for significant expenses. They have never been able to explain why they could not budget and did not budget for the predicted H1N1 pandemic. We had to budget for that. Their budget for public sector wage settlements was effectively zero, Mr. Speaker. We had to budget for a more reasonable settlement, even if it still falls short of what many people would hope for. The previous government left a number of significant unbudgeted bills, like over $8 million just for the EnerGuide program alone. Mr. Speaker, the previous government also left behind a complex and confusing funding arrangement with our universities. This was no fault of the universities, who were simply looking for predictable multi-year funding. But the previous government shifted money around so that there were essentially 2 full years of funding in the last fiscal year and essentially no funding this year. We made the decision to bring that complex and confusing arrangement to an end. As a result of all of these factors, lower revenue, unbudgeted expenses, and the paying out of the university MOU, there is a significant budget deficit this year, and our amendments to the Provincial Finance Act contained in this Financial Measures Act reflect that reality. Our amendments to the Provincial Finance Act have the effect of establishing one and only one accounting standard, which is Generally Accepted Accounting Principles, or GAAP. The previous government's attempt to legislate a different definition of deficit to take into account the offshore offset payments from the federal government ultimately led to confusion rather than to clarity. Now, the ostensible purpose of that clause was a good one. It was to ensure that the $830 million received by the provincial government went on the debt and stayed on the debt. However, Mr. Speaker, let us be clear. That did not happen even under the previous government. Essentially, the previous government used the offshore offset provision to create room to spend more money on capital projects. As a result, despite the offshore offset provision, this province's debt continued to climb. Like every other province in Canada, Mr. Speaker, we believe that GAAP, Generally Accepted Accounting Principles, will provide the clearest picture of the province's finances. Under these amendments to the Provincial Finance Act, the definition of deficit will be the same as the definition under Generally Accepted Accounting Principles. Mr. Speaker, this is ultimately the clearest and the simplest way, the most transparent way to present the province's books. We are amending the Provincial Finance Act because we believe that fiscal responsibility and fiscal discipline does not come from a statute. It comes from an abiding belief that the government must live within its means. That is a commitment this government has given and which we intend to keep. Mr. Speaker, I would now like to move on from the changes to the Provincial Finance Act and speak to several other measures in the Financial Measures Act that support new commitments we made to Nova Scotians in the budget tabled on September 24th. We understand that in these times of economic uncertainty, it is important, it is essential to grow Nova Scotia's economy. We also know that there are several key components that go into building a strong, vibrant economy. One of those components, Mr. Speaker, is a skilled and educated workforce. That's why this government is increasing and extending the incentive for new graduates to live and work in Nova Scotia by replacing the graduate tax credit with a new graduate retention rebate. Under the new rebate, the total tax credit amounts have been increased to $15,000 for university graduates and $7,500 for college graduates. Another key component, Mr. Speaker, is investment in the local business community. Since 1994, approximately $160 million has been invested in Nova Scotia enterprises through the equity tax credit. In order to provide an even greater incentive for individuals to invest in Nova Scotia's small businesses, cooperatives, and community economic development initiatives, we are increasing, in this Financial Measures Act, the equity tax credit rate from 30 to 35%. The higher This higher tax credit is expected to provide over $1 million to support investments in Nova Scotia enterprises. Mr. Speaker, just another thing that this government is doing to support the work, the very fine work, of the Minister of Economic and Rural Development. Mr. Speaker, boosting the equity tax credit in this Financial Measures Act is just one more element of the government's plan to support jobs that Nova Scotia's economy needs. Mr. Speaker, the changes that I have highlighted indicate the importance and relevance and scope of this year's Financial Measures Act. It supports the budget presented on September 24th and is, for all practical purposes, a part of that budget. This is a bill, Mr. Speaker, containing good measures that deserve the support of the entire House, measures that will make a difference to families, businesses, and communities across the province. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. And I'll now recognize the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise and say a few words around the Financial Measures Act. Mr. Speaker, it seems a little bit like deja vu. It seems like we were here not that long ago, and I'm sure Nova Scotians are asking themselves what happens to politicians when they leave the opposition ranks and go to government. How come the view is much different? And I know that the Minister of Finance will often say that they've backtracked on so many promises. It's because now that they're in government and they're in cabinet, they get a full picture. They get a full picture of the financial state of our province. I believe the Minister has said when you get the full picture, you get all of what's happened and you get all the briefings, and it changes their view on goes forward, Mr. Speaker. When he stood on this side of the House, he opposed breaking the law of the province of Nova Scotia. When he walked across the aisle to government side, it's one of the first things they did. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, I remember traveling this province, having to explain to Nova Scotians why we were into an election. And while I believe the previous government was misleading Nova Scotians, and I believe the previous government was breaking the law of our province as well, or attempting to, Mr. Speaker, we said to Nova Scotians that we as a caucus would not participate in changing any law retroactively. And I can tell you, when the Premier today during the election stood in front of Nova Scotians saying he would balance the books, he knew full well he couldn't do it. He knew full well he couldn't do it, Mr. Speaker. He knew the full picture of the finances of our province, and he knew he couldn't deliver on that promise. And within the first 100 days of this government, what do we see? A $592 million deficit. And approximately $500 million of that lands directly at the feet of this Premier and the Minister of Finance. They went out and they hired a consultant, Deloitte, to give them a report on the financial picture of our province. They gave them parameters that would create a deficit that, in my view, Mr. Speaker, doesn't reflect reality. Every Nova Scotian knew that government couldn't continue to spend at the rate they were going to, and everyone who was running for public office should have recognized the fact that no new government could continue to spend at the rate the previous government was doing. But what did they do? They said to Deloitte, let's use the same spending practices of the previous government to create some fictitious number that's out there, so that when we come in and underscore it a bit, we'll look like we've done a good job. Well, that report also told this Minister of Finance and this government not to be paying any lump sum payments in advance. And Mr. Speaker, $341 million of that deficit is because this government, the New Democratic government of Nova Scotia, decided to pay a bill in advance. The Minister of Finance criticizes the previous government for making 2 payments in 1 year and not one this, and he wanted to bring some clarity to it. The clarity was, Mr. Speaker, is to pay a lump sum payment in advance, hoping to convince Nova Scotians that it was the previous government's fault that we now have a $592 million deficit. Mr. Speaker, another one of their plans is an $81 million to purchase land. You know, I wouldn't say that anyone would disagree that Nova Scotia should own more of its own land. But to quote the Minister of Finance, these are tough economic times. And government is about making choices. And in tough economic times, that means you have to make tough choices. But instead, what this government has done is played politics, the future of our province and the finances of our province. In 4 months, the legacy of this Premier and this Minister of Finance and this government is they ballooned our deficit by $592 million on their own decisions. It would be nice to stand in this House and debate whether or not we really believe we should be spending $81 million on land. But before we can do that, this government has to take responsibility for the decisions it made instead of attempting to put it off on the previous government. It was interesting as you look at some of the decisions that this government has made, and I was interested to finally hear the Minister of Finance say that one of the ways forward is to grow our economy. They made $13 million in cuts and subsequently went and took that $13 million and dropped it in this little industrial expansion slush fund that the front row on the opposite side will get an opportunity to hand out. Mr. Speaker, that wasn't about building our economy. That was about giving them some political tools to build towards an election campaign. If they truly wanted to build the economy of this province and hit every community from one end of this province to the other, they would have aggressively attacked the small business tax in this province and provided the entrepreneurs of our province, who will grow the economy if given the right circumstances, a break on the small business tax and allowed them to do what they've done for generations, and that has seen our province through good and tough economic times, and they've invested in their people and in their communities, and it's why we have weathered tough economic times before. And if they can only get a partner in government, I believe it is why we will weather this tough economic time. Mr. Speaker, during the election campaign, the Premier was convinced and told all Nova Scotians that he would provide a balanced budget next year. And if that's the case, why are we changing the Finance Act beyond one deficit budget? If he's actually going to keep his word to the people of Nova Scotia, he's going to do what he said he was going to do, then why are we changing it beyond this fiscal year? I'll tell you why, Mr. Speaker, because I don't believe they have a plan to move our province forward, and they know they need the room to run deficit budget after deficit budget. The Minister of Finance said that every provincial province had balanced budget legislation. and they had to change them through these tough economic times. Well, I'm going to tell you, Mr. Speaker, they had that legislation in June, and they had that legislation in May, and many of those provinces had changed it. But it was this Minister of Finance and this Premier and this government that told Nova Scotians they wouldn't need to change it. They wouldn't need to use the offshore offset payment either. They would be able to do and make all the commitments, pay for them, and deliver a balanced budget next year. If they are truly going to do that and believe they can still do that, then why aren't we only tabling, why aren't the changes to this Finance Act only talking about one deficit budget? In essence, what this minister is asking for is a license in our province to run continuous deficit budgets. And quite frankly, in 4 months at $592 million at the rate he's going, there won't be much of a province left if we give him that opportunity. They were so opposed on this side of the House about using the offshore offset payment. They talked about how this government, the previous government, was breaking the law. What changed? What changed? A few members of the former government got to stay home. A few new members came to the Democratic Party. But they walked across the aisle and are doing the same thing. Committing the same, in my view, breaking the law in our province to meet their political needs. This has nothing to do about the health of our province financially or going forward. I know that the Minister of Finance has heard this, I'm sure, plenty, as he talks about his $592 million deficit. One of the things he said a while ago, which I found rather interesting, was he actually believed that the previous government had balanced their budget. I don't share that view. I never shared that view. But I would say the Minister of Finance suggested, I think it was roughly $7 million surplus. Help me with the number. Somewhere in there, neighborhood, yeah. And it was in the Red Room when he stood in front of the media and said, yeah, well, it would be balanced. And it's balanced. It's only balanced if they do. It's only balanced if they did what he's doing, and that's breaking the law. And that's what he's doing, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Finance is suggesting that we're mixing things up. I think he should probably reread his budget. $351 million advance payment, setting aside $81 million to purchase land that we're not sure what land that's going to be, setting aside an additional $54 million in a government restructuring fund. These were all decisions that were made by this Minister of Finance and this Premier because they are taking this tough economic time in our country and globally and using it for political purposes. Yes, the NDP, they would be doing that. In my short time in the House, Mr. Speaker, one of the things that I think will be interesting as this fiscal year continues to unfold and as we build towards next year is whether or not this minister and this government is prepared to make some of the tough decisions that are going to have to be made in the province of Nova Scotia. For the life of me, as I was campaigning in 2 by-elections and I was thinking about the rink revitalization program that this government scrapped, took out of the previous government's budget, and when I was in Port Hood at the Al McGuinness Arena speaking to the rink association and them telling me that they had counted on that $27,000. They went out and took out a personal loan of $25,000 to cover the bills because that Premier and that Minister of Finance and that government told Nova Scotians they would live up to the previous commitments, the former government, and plus meet all the commitments they had made. Balancing the budget, not using the offshore offset, and the list goes on. Once they moved to that side of the House, though, Mr. Speaker, all the rules changed. What they said on the campaign trail really didn't matter. Maybe they didn't have the full picture. When they told the communities that they would meet the commitments of the previous government, those arenas believed that rank revitalization program would still be here. But instead, they were delivered the sad news. Mr. Speaker, if you go back from Confederation to 1978, the debt of our province was somewhere around $577 million. The constituency that I represent was represented by the late Peter Nicholson, who was the finance minister of our province and who delivered a balanced budget at that time, and he was defeated. But our entire debt from Confederation until that point is less than the 4-month legacy of this government. In 4 months, they've accumulated a $592 million deficit, all from decisions that I believe they made. Governing is about tough choices, Mr. Speaker. Governing is about tough choices, Mr. Speaker. Government is about tough choices, and in tough economic times, the Minister of Finance should be prepared to make tough decisions. Don't ask Nova Scotians for the right and the privilege to govern this province if you're unprepared to make the tough choices that are required. Instead, hiding behind the fact of another government, Nova Scotians had already passed judgment. It's time for you as Minister of Finance and the Premier of our province to take responsibility for the decisions they have made and tell Nova Scotians the truth. This is more about their political future, Mr. Speaker, than it has anything to do with about growing our economy, anything to do with those 25,000 community college students, anything to do with our public schools. It has everything to do with when the next elections will be called and their political future. They are not making decisions that reflect the reality of our province today. Instead, Mr. Speaker, they're hiding behind a government that was defeated. They're hiding behind a government who Nova Scotians said couldn't balance the books. And what they're attempting to do is offload their decisions onto this government. Mr. Speaker, we will continue in this House to provide constructive opposition. We will provide constructive opposition in this House. And we will continue to hold this government to account. Mr. Speaker, I think the Minister of Finance has more of a speech he hasn't given yet. The fact of the matter is, if the Minister of Finance has showed as much energy and courage when he was putting his budget together as he's shown sitting on his seat over on the other side of the House, we might have a different financial picture in our province today. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to hold this government to account. We will continue to point out to Nova Scotians that when it comes to making tough choices, the backbone just isn't there. What they will do is they will ask my children, your children, their children to make those choices. They'll say one thing on election day and quite something else on budget day. They will say one thing to get to that side of the House, Mr. Speaker, but they won't live up to the commitment. They won't live up to what they said to Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. We will continue to provide constructive opposition. We will continue to point out every time this government falls back on the word and the commitment it has made to Nova Scotians. But let's be clear about one thing, Mr. Speaker. this deficit that we have in the province of Nova Scotia today for this fiscal year has been manufactured and created not by some previous government. It's been created by the government today. In 4 months, they've left a great legacy of a $592 million deficit. Mr. Speaker, with those few remarks, I look forward to listening as members make comment on the Financial Measures Act, and I look forward to members opposite standing up and justifying to Nova Scotians, why we are at a $592 million deficit. And not one of those decisions, Mr. Speaker, and not one of the decisions they made will grow the economy of our province. They won't grow the economy of the province. They won't create jobs. All it will do is protect the jobs of the members of that side of the House. Mr. Speaker, thanks very much for allowing me to participate in this debate.
Thank you, member, and I'll now recognize the Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will be giving a few brief introductory remarks and response to Bill 29. The more detailed and more specific comments will be coming from our finance critic. But I would not be able to leave this debate without speaking on behalf of our caucus with respect to what statements are being made to mislead Nova Scotians about whose budget is currently being considered. And we know that the budget that was presented is clearly an NDP budget. It's misleading to suggest otherwise. And there are a number of reasons why this is not a Tory budget. I want to make sure, and I know the Minister of Finance has articulated some of the similarities and some of the differences, but I would suggest that the differences certainly outweigh the similarities. Although there may be some programs, Mr. Speaker, within this budget that would be similar to ones that we would have proposed, the budget line associated with them, the criteria for eligibility for each of them, and the implementation differ greatly from those that were part of our presentation and part of our budget. I just want to explain a little bit about the history of where we were and where we have come from over the last 10 years. No surprise to the members opposite or members on either side of the House that one of the legacies of the Progressive Conservative government over the last 10 years, and in particular during the leadership of former Premier John Hamm, was to present balanced budgets for this province. And that was something that did not come easily. We're talking about what has been inherited, and I would remind folks in the House that when this party came to power, they inherited something that was not pleasant. But they did take the opportunity to look at the resources they had, to look at the situation that was presented to them, and to try to find a way to bring some credibility and some stability to the building of the budgets. And for 7 consecutive years, Mr. Speaker, the Conservative government did present balanced budget, and that's something of which we always will be very proud. It has been stated that the economic conditions at the time were different, and I will acknowledge that to be so. However, I would like to remind members of the House that the budget that we had presented and prepared in May of 2009 was also a balanced budget. But I also want to agree and make note of the fact that in order to do that balancing of that budget, there were some important steps that we felt we needed to take. And it was that step which would allow us to redirect offshore dollars to balance that budget that brought this government, our government, down and the very people who are now talking about how they're going to bring about legislative change, and the people who are standing on our side at this point in time, all recognized, obviously, that they wanted to use that for their own political gain. It's ironic that we are now standing here looking at a Financial Measures Act that does some of the same things that we were criticized for doing. But there are three particular clauses, Mr. Speaker, that trouble this party and trouble our caucus, 27, 28, and 29. And those have been referenced when the minister spoke. He talked about those particular changes. And the message that that sends to us and to all Nova Scotians is that the government now has a license for uncontrolled spending, no accountability, and the ability to present, as they indicated they would, a balanced budget is no longer something to which they can be held accountable. For that reason, it will not be the changes in the Financial Measures Act will not be something that we can afford and that we can support, because that license for uncontrolled spending is something that we do not stand for. When you look at the $592 million that was presented, artificially created, in order to give them an opportunity to say we have been left with a huge deficit, I think it's important to note that in difficult times and when the resources in the province are limited and when we are in an economic downturn, some of the expenditures were not important to make at this particular time. Maybe important when resources are in a better shape and when our economy is thriving, but not now. But this government opted to add to a list of deficit spending that would create artificially a huge deficit, and they could go out to the province and say, look what we inherited. Well, the $66 million for land purchases, not a bad idea, but is the time right? We maintain it is not. $54 million in the restructuring fund to deal with, and we've seen a little bit of that already, to deal with the wage settlements. $15 million for the HST rebate. Decision to make that a universal program has cost this government $15 million for the balance of the year, $30 for a full year. And you tell me, Mr. Speaker, how that will sit with families in Nova Scotia who are depending on social programs so they can eat and so they can be warm and so they can clothe their children. That did not have to be and was not in our budget a universal program. But this government opted to be nice to everyone at the expense of some of those most in need. We looked at the home construction rebate. That was intended and was announced that it would be an incentive for people to build, an incentive to stimulate the economy by having people, tradespeople, working in our province. And yet, when the implementation and the application of that was known, the incentive was gone because it went to reward those people who had already built their homes. So an incentive to encourage building and stimulate the economy was soon lost. And of course, the last one, the huge number that has contributed to the 592 is the 353 repayment for universities. And we recognize that when there's a surplus, that was a good investment to make because it takes it off your next year's book. But when you don't have the money and you have to borrow the money and you have to add that to a deficit, it is certainly not a very wise and prudent financial decision. So, Mr. Speaker, all of these things have come together and they have allowed this government to present a budget, and I will repeat my opening comments. It is not a Tory budget. It is not a budget that we would have presented, and Nova Scotians need to understand that, and Nova Scotians will not be fooled by that. They can do the math just the same as we can. I want to close my comments by saying that In difficult times, I think everybody in this House agrees that some difficult decisions have to be made. We listened to that during the campaign. We are into the 4 months of an NDP government. It will be 4 years. That's the trouble, Mr. Speaker. And during those 4 months, we have yet to see a tough decision that would be made within the financial means of this province. Those are the concerns that we have. Those are the concerns that Nova Scotians have, and has been stated. Those are the things that Nova Scotians will pay for in the long term. So the changes and the recommendations to the Financial Measures Act that allow this government to have uncontrolled spending, to not have the deficit as the first charge on the next year, and to allow offshore to be redirected whenever, as long as, are certainly not examples of fiscal management and good decision-making. So, Mr. Speaker, as I've said, this is not something that we can support. I will allow my my finance critic, at another time in this debate to be more specific with the details. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and very, very pleased today to rise and address the Financial Measures Act. I think I heard the leader of the Conservative Party say it felt like 4 years, I guess, because I was here for 6 years and we had all balanced budgets, if I remember correctly, but maybe my memory is not so good. But anyway, that being said, the question today around the Financial Measures Act, of course, is that we do not support legislation which retroactively changes the law. We're here today facing the exact same question that we had earlier this year. So it's a position that we have not changed. And so the Financial Measures Act now allows a minister to table a deficit budget. That's the big change that is occurring in this legislation. Furthermore, the offshore offset, which had to go on the provincial debt, which all of us in this House, regardless of our political affiliations, felt that it was time that Nova Scotians address the future of our children and grandchildren, that we would start to deal with the debt of this province, which we now see will start to rise once again. It is, in fact, probably whenever I leave the legislature, not feeling that I've had some kind of positive impact on what my grandchildren will have to face. That as our interest on the debt once again approaches $1 billion, it's almost difficult to fathom, but it's the great reality that faces our province. We'd have no worry about settlements for the contracts that are coming forward if we had dealt with this some time ago. So that leads me to the point that the changes in the Financial Measures Act are not about 1 year. They're not permitting a deficit for 1 year. There's no sunset clause on deficits going forward. And even though we do live in more challenging fiscal times, as the Minister of Finance has pointed out, revenues are down, and we know the demands on our services are indeed extreme. But not to put forward at least the challenge that by next year we'd be working with due diligence towards a balanced budget, and it doesn't seem now to have that kind of accommodation inside the Financial Measures Act. It's a little bit easier when you open up that legislation. I think it makes for an easier way to be content that we only have this much of a deficit. So in some ways now, there's the blank check concept that's available to this government as they move into the future. And if we heard of anything during the campaign, and especially in the times we live in, and government has been echoing that sentiment now for months, and that is to have the greatest possible fiscal responsibility is in fact a precondition, I believe, of good government. So the Minister of Finance himself, when he was on this side of the House, he trumpeted the need for fiscal responsibility and the need to ensure that government spent the public purse wisely now and into the future. And as the leader of the opposition stated in his remarks, he went against some very, very strong advice. Advice that Nova Scotians paid $100,000 to provide government with good insight. And that was not to make, prepayments, not to make large one-time payment, even during the next fiscal year, giving it out in a quarterly manner to universities. Universities found, in my discussions with 3 presidents, found no problems with the way it was done in the past, and I'm sure they won't find a big problem knowing they're going to get the money, but they would be content also to receive quarterly payments in the next fiscal year. So government has moved away from the Deloitte recommendation and will borrow that money on the last day of the fiscal year. That's right, the money will be borrowed. It probably won't be in the Treasury by that time. So the changes made in the Financial Measures Act in some ways now I think are very different than the minister's words of some months ago. And again, they're moving away from fiscal accountability, and especially in the context of a majority government. During the news conference for the introduction of this bill, the minister said that legislating balanced budgets simply doesn't work. He said that governments will spend in good times, they will repeal such legislation in bad times. However, with this bill, he has proven that the NDP will repeal balanced budget legislation in tough economic times. And if this government would go so far as to remove all fiscal restraints today, there is nothing that will comfort Nova Scotians who fear they will not continue to practice into the future. And I think this is the point that we're making around the Financial Measures Act this year, because again, we could see it being done perhaps for the 1 year. The minister has said that Nova Scotians will only have to trust us. Well, we don't see the strong reasons why. The government has tabled a balanced deficit budget, and it is truly an NDP budget. None of us here on this side of the House anticipated a $592 million bill to be placed in the public treasury. We knew that while we were in more difficult times, that we would not be saddled with that kind of deficit this year or in the years to come. And so the debt is indeed increased. It was interesting that the NDP ran a campaign that promised balanced budgets when they knew there was obviously no possibility that they could deliver. When we left the House here on May the 4th, we knew that the budget of the province was well balanced. On March 31st, we were moving away from a balanced position by May the 4th, and there was no way they could deliver on that promise. Instead of introducing measures and policies that would show a comprehensive strategy to stimulate Nova Scotia's economy, they are approaching growth through piecemeal offerings to select businesses and communities. Once again, I think having been in opposition, and a stronger opposition for a decade, Nova Scotians thought there would be this plan coming forward. Now we're being advised that, we won't do it now, wait till spring, which was an old adage to get Nova Scotians doing some building and repairs a few years ago to stimulate the economy. I won't comment on the stimulation of the housing industry at this time, which is only a half measure. But so piecemeal offerings are not what will revive and reinvigorate the Nova Scotia economy, but rather a comprehensive plan is what we were hoping would be part of both the budget speech and the throne speech and the budget speech. We thought they would be complementary documents to Nova Scotia. And in fact, the throne speech was pretty much the opposite. In fact, perhaps one of the dullest throne speech in some time. So we don't have those measures introduced. Instead of providing Nova Scotians with clear and transparent accounting, the NDP choose to pay a bill that they wouldn't come due until the next fiscal year. And the Minister of Finance does like to put his slant, his view on that, but more and more Nova Scotians now, just ordinary Nova Scotians that I speak with, they don't have degrees in business or finance, but they understand that they, in fact, the wool has been pulled over their eyes. We actually didn't need to pay the $341 million in this fiscal year, and that we actually don't have, in reality check, in present time, a $592 million deficit. So around this whole budget, Nova Scotians are really talking now about credibility. Credibility of a government that pronounced it vigorously in opposition, but don't seem to be carrying through now. So instead of applying the offshore offset payment to the debt, it is using it to pay for NDP programs. And make no mistake about it, Mr. Speaker, we are well over 100 days into the NDP government, and these are NDP choices, these are NDP programs, and this is an NDP deficit. And it is one of the real disappointments that we've reached this point in the fiscal state of the province, that we didn't go to course on the offshore offset. To think of even getting that interest on the debt, halfway of $1 billion, in the next decade, would be a wonderful achievement. But it now looks like we're moving in the opposite direction. So these decisions that the NDP government have made since taking government are easy to understand. They are simply political. And with the exception of those who are sitting across from me today, no one in this province will really benefit from them. After promising the people of Nova Scotia that they could balance the budget without raising taxes and without cutting services, the NDP hired a consulting firm to tell Nova Scotians that we were facing tough economic times. The people that I meet and talk with in my riding and up and down the Annapolis Valley know that this is a more difficult time, and especially when you consider that in our province now we are approaching 10% unemployment. So it's reaching more and more into many families and many of our communities. What was important was that the report showed that the province was facing tough economic times, but it didn't matter how tough as long as it changed the rules of the debate and that the public might accept deficit spending by the NDP. The artificially inflated the budget, which the NDP hopes will be labelled a progressive conservative budget, and this also made it artificially easier to balance in the next fiscal year. And again, we've talked about that from both parties on this side of the House. More and more, as I said, Nova Scotians are not being fooled by the large deficit, by the one-time payment. And like the member opposite, perhaps a wonderful investment in Nova Scotia's future is the purchasing of land and moving towards the national goal of 12% protected lands. And I've certainly, as the critic for natural resources, have advocated for this since I arrived here at Province House. However, was this the right time? Was this the right time to add another $70 million deficit to our provincial budget? So I think if we had that debate, even among Nova Scotians who are so keen, so committed, and themselves who have contributed to organizations like Nature Trust, would say that perhaps that amount of money at this point in time may in fact have not been the best wisdom, the best course of action. So Nova Scotians now that know that we have made, government has made a number of NDP choices. A few of the areas that I would like to touch upon that were in the budget, of course, was the changes, first of all, to the heating assistance rebate program. We know that government did blink around the Nova Scotia Community College teachers possibly going out on strike. We don't know what the settlement is yet. I have a feeling that before this winter is over and Nova Scotians see that the HARP program is not delivering to the same level as it did in previous years, and especially last year, I think there'll be a lot of heat, in fact, on this government. I'm already hearing, getting a lot of calls to our office that, again, this was part of the natural expectation from an NDP government, that, in fact, there would be a very strong rebate program that Nova Scotians would be able to tap into. So now we know that there was very little talk about this during the heat of the summer, during the heat of the provincial election, and now again the reality that Nova Scotians will have less to deal with heating their homes in the coming months. And we've already had actually a couple of weeks already when Nova Scotians have had to turn their heat on. So this is not really in line with the NDP government that I sat opposite with, who talked very strongly, very principled about looking after the poor, looking after those that hurt in our society. Many of them not not because of their own doing, but rather situations, curveballs that are thrown families and make for very difficult times. So I think this is the kind of program that Nova Scotians will not have forgotten 4 years down the road. They'll remember this turn of events, this change in the HARP program, and is one that we do need. We in opposition will remind government on an ongoing basis that in their first budget, this was part of letting Nova Scotians down. Another one of the areas that comes under, of course, the budget is the caregiver allowance debacle. And I know that we could bring cases here now on a daily basis, cases that truly tug, I'm sure, at the heartstrings of everybody in this House. And I think we're not too far away from hearing from some members actually in government that there's some things that are just not going right about this program. We can talk all we want about the MAPLE criteria that is used to determine whether somebody gets this help. But When I knocked on doors this summer, and people were asking, if we form government, would we be bringing in a caregiver program? And as you know, we pushed government to run a pilot, a couple of pilots actually in Cape Breton. I know in the member for Richmond's riding, it ran for a period of time. It was pulled back. Then there was some fine-tuning done, and it was reintroduced again. And the people who received it benefited immensely from it. I think that the unfortunate thing that has happened here is the expectations that were created with the realities now that Nova Scotians are faced. And we're going to hear more about this again in the coming weeks and months. For anybody who's had the opportunity to go across Nova Scotia, visit a lot of our small communities, we know that the rink, the arena, is an absolutely central community gathering place in many of those communities. And the more we hear about the change in the rink revitalization program, again, where communities have to try and in fact raise dollars to be able to get some help. For example, it was interesting talking to people at a hockey game at the Al McGuinness rink in Inverness. And here we now heard of the board of directors had to take out loans to keep that place open because of the games being played by government on this. And so they decided to cut $25,000 in funding to that arena and to 5 other communities, for example, in the riding of Inverness. So if we go to many of these little communities, think of the number that in fact are called centennial arenas. So many of them now are 40+ years of age. This loss of support to keeping these rinks going is not being lost, is not being harbored just by the board of directors. This voice now, this message is getting out to the larger community, that there's going to be precious little help available if their rink is having difficult times. So these are a few areas that this budget touches upon. Probably the one that is the greatest misleader of all is the graduate retention tax credit. In fact, it has been blasted by some of the best friends of the NDP, the Federation of Students. They have blasted this program as absolutely missing the mark. This program missed the mark. We didn't have to look to the Alliance of Nova Scotia Students. Right from the Federation, we heard directly and unequivocally that this will do precious little about retention. And again, the great mislead of $15,000 coming to your pocket. Well, not in this lifetime. So it's precious little of an incentive in that particular program, but it did sound great with the way that it was advertised. So over the next weeks and months, we're going to hear Nova Scotia, without question, see this budget as the NDP's first budget. They're not waiting till spring. They're already starting to cast some judgment on the direction that we see the province going. And especially if I heard any one message when I went to the doors in my riding, and I still hear today, is one very clear message, that if the NDP became government, they would do things differently. That's the one message that I heard in the summer and I continue to hear, and they're seeing that things aren't too dramatically different. And so I think we'll soon see that Nova Scotians have in fact been deceived on some of the promises and how they're being delivered. So I think today, as we look at voting on the Financial Measures Act, that piece of legislation may not be drilled down on by too many Nova Scotians, but definitely seeing the large deficit is an area that Nova Scotians are taking a look at and are disappointed that we will continue to grow the debt in our province, and in fact, you know, our pattern of relying on tremendous amounts of federal subsidies, equalization, letting the offset payment go for programs. Again, there's no visionary piece around how we're going to move financially in this province, how we're going to change the course of doing business fiscally. And so I think that's what Nova Scotians now are starting to see. One last area that you know had all the right ring to it, removing the HST. But you know, again, should it be a universal program? Is one that I think should get a reconsideration, and it's one that we'll have to ask questions about. You know, not all provinces have their electricity without taxation. It certainly goes against the NDP philosophy, and the people that I talk to in my community that run programs like Feed My Lambs. You know, when a heated swimming pool in a home in the South End gets electricity break, something doesn't quite jive with that ring. And it's something that Nova Scotians said, again, why not a means test? Why not a means test? Yeah, a means test would have put this program in good order. Or do as you have with Bangor Hydro, where you have different rates for different amounts of electrical consumption. And could we ever use that in this province, where our utility is one of the 5 worst polluters in Canada? So government didn't do anything bold here. They just simply fulfilled a political initiative and not really something that is far-reaching and that has positive implications for Nova Scotia's fiscal and overall health and well-being for the future. So these are the things that I think if we look beneath the Financial Measures Act, we look beneath the budget, and as I alluded to very quickly, also the throne speech. We never really saw that kind of commitment to a change that Nova Scotians were led to believe would be very evident, something that they would start to see and feel, and I think that's the part that we'll see whether or not the second budget from the NDP and their future plans will be a clear direction for the province. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I take my place.
Thank you. The Honourable Member for Argyle.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to stand up today and talk about Bill 28. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to try my best to talk sense. I know the Minister of Finance wants to see some clarity when talking to this budget, some clarity that maybe he wasn't able to present, or maybe the Liberals have not been able to present during their time talking to this. Bill 29, Mr. Speaker, of course, is enabling legislation. It's legislation that accompanies, of course, the estimates that we spent so much time on here in the House over the last number of weeks. But, Mr. Speaker, what the bill doesn't really provide us with is sort of the background. You know, you look at some of these innocuous things, you know, Section 2076 of Chapter 365, the revised statutes 1989, the Provincial Finance Act, is repealed. Okay, well, really, what does that mean? And, Mr. Speaker, I'm just quoting from the bill, so I can table it later on after I'm done. But, Mr. Speaker, I know the member opposite, the Minister of Finance, when he stood as the opposition critic on finance, said some of these very same things. You know, what do they really mean? And so what I thought I would do over the next number of minutes, I would probably go to maybe what exactly these little things mean, and really reference what they say in the Provincial Finance Act. So we'll do that one. Mr. Speaker, you know, sort of a glossary of what I'm going to be doing tonight for the next half hour or so. And I'm going to go look at the commitment, the true commitment that was held within the NDP platform, exactly what they have committed to, and really what's going on today. And Mr. Speaker, I'll probably do some of the same things that the member for Hants West, or for Kings West spoke about. Are some of the programs that Nova Scotians feel important that are not included or have been cut from this budget, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I would like to say and to support what my leader said during her time here, was to basically say this is not, let me say it again, this is not the Progressive Conservative budget that was brought forward in May. And Mr. Speaker, you know, I know the members opposite will say, well, you know, it's your budget. Well, you know, there was almost 3 months of time that transpired between our tabling of the budget, the subsequent defeat of that budget, or the defeat of the amendment, and the bringing forward of this budget in this legislature once again. Mr. Speaker, I can say that the glaring difference between our budget and their budget really falls into the $592 million deficit. Mr. Speaker, I can say that when we were doing our work at the cabinet table, when we were bringing the numbers forward, when the Department of Finance would come in and present with new numbers, Mr. Speaker, we picked a set of numbers that were as accurate as they possibly could be at that time. Mr. Speaker, with the numbers that we submitted, with the adjustment that we asked, we knew we would end up having a small deficit if we didn't make a change, and that change, of course, was the offshore offset. And I'll talk about that one a little bit later on as well. But, Mr. Speaker, our budget would have been the 8th consecutive budget that was balanced to be brought forward in this legislature within the 10-year span of the Progressive Conservative government. So, Mr. Speaker, 3 months later, we see a budget that looks a lot. You know, hey, I can compare our budget with the previous year's budget, or you can look at a budget in 1992 versus one in 2002. And you know what? Structurally, they're going to look like pretty similar budgets. Mr. Speaker, they all have the departments listed in, the expenditures therein, of course, the estimate to actual, and all that stuff that ends up in it. But, Mr. Speaker, our budget, you know, that was brought into May versus the budget that is before us today for consideration are not the same budget. So what I can say about this is that when the NDP were able to bring forward in their first test, this is their first test of what they've said is what they said, what they're going to do. And what we see today is that they failed the first test. They failed the first test. They're bringing forward a much larger budget, a much larger deficit than what they should have. And let me be honest. Let me be honest, as I try to be here. You're always honest. Mr. Speaker, without that adjustment, and maybe with over time, the numbers change. You know, and we know that the numbers change. That they might have came in with a deficit of maybe $100 million or whatever. They're a new government. They would have tried to be everything to everybody. So they would have thrown some stuff on a deficit because, of course, they can blame the previous government for this deficit, which they've done over and over again. And Mr. Speaker, that's not fooling Nova Scotians either. You know, Mr. Speaker, what Nova Scotians are telling me at the coffee shop is that they're the government now. They're the ones that can make the decisions. They're the ones that should be making the changes. And they're not. They just continue to hide behind the blame game. And Nova Scotians are getting tired of that. So, you know, hopefully once this budget passes in this House, and it will pass, Mr. Speaker, we'll be voting against it, but they now have a majority government and therefore can pass this budget. So it will get passed. And I hope at that point that a little bit of this blame game will change. And don't get me wrong, hey, we blame the Liberals for everything that went wrong for 10 years. So, Mr. Speaker, I can tell you through the end, there was a reason for that. Through the end, though, we used it very sparingly. We only used it when we really had to. So, Mr. Speaker, I hope over the next number of months that less of this blame game will be played and that the NDP cabinet that's in front of me will get down to working on their new budget, get down on doing their job of providing a better place for families. You know, that's what they worked on. Mr. Speaker, it says within their election platform, and I'm going to say Darrell Dexter and the NDP know that the debt and deficits are not the road to prosperity. The NDP is committed to ensuring that Nova Scotia lives within its means, starting with a smaller cabinet. Let me stop at smaller cabinet. Okay, there's 12 people in that cabinet. But now we know that there's junior ministers in this cabinet. You know, maybe they don't sit at that table, but they're getting very specific things to go do. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Transportation stood in during his estimates yesterday, and he talked about the member for Queens going out and doing work on gravel roads. Mr. Speaker, I know that the member for Sackville-Cobequid represented the Minister of Acadian Affairs at a meeting in Vancouver or Victoria, I believe. So, Mr. Speaker, you know, regardless if they're junior ministers or in the case of Halifax Citadel Sable Island, Minister wannabe.
Minister Emeritus.
So, Minister Emeritus. I did really enjoyed that one. I did enjoy that one. Mr. Speaker, even though there's only 12 people on the payroll.
That could go a lot of ways there.
Howie went to India. What did he get to do?
Mr. Speaker, knowing that there's only 12 people on the payroll, we're seeing that there will be other tasks assigned to other people. And Mr. Speaker, I can say that they will have expenses. They will have to travel from time to time. They'll have to see the areas. And I'm wondering out loud, who's going to be paying for that?
Taxpayers.
But is it the taxpayer for the monies from this House as an MLA? Or will Cabinet be paying for those? The departments be paying for those? We don't know. So let me continue. And I know it's a sore spot because they wouldn't react to it as much as they do when we mention the issue of junior ministers.
Baby minister.
Or, yeah, I won't repeat it, but I know the people have heard the member for Yarmouth and his comments. Mr. Speaker, they also committed to an independent audit.
Some of them are on soothers.
Audit, and we've already heard the response to that one. I guess it really wasn't an audit, and we're all, you know, really they're not real recommendations, so we're not really going to accept them. Anyway, to find out the true state of the province's finances, an expenditure management review across the public sector will save up to 1% in non-essential spending. So, you know, going into this, you know, and Mr. Speaker, I could table it. I've tabled it on a number of occasions. I'm sure the clerk doesn't want to have another one for the list. So, but I'll keep this one because I love referencing it. It's just a better deal. You've seen it before. It's a really nice blue. It's a very nice blue document with a little bit of orange thrown in. And I wonder why they did that. But what we can see is they didn't use any red because they knew they wouldn't get anywhere with those folks.
Everything's red now.
So, Mr. Speaker, let me speak a little bit to the bill itself, which I'm sure that
The Minister Emeritus.
the Minister Emeritus really wants me to get to. So let me speak a little bit on that. And what I'm going to be doing is referencing maybe some of the clauses that we find in Bill number 29 that are being deleted from the Provincial Finance Act. And the ones that stand out the most, and if I may, Mr. Speaker, really falls in around Part 9, which is the Provincial Finance Act. And if I read them this way, number 27, Section 70, and I said this one before, Section 76 of Chapter 365, the revised statute 1989, the Provincial Finance Act, is repealed. So, of course, for the effect, Mr. Speaker, of the people in this House, and of course for maybe the people that are lucky enough to be watching this on TV, I thought I would read what that section is. And then basically that section is no budget with deficit. It says 76, in each fiscal year of the province, commencing with the 02-03 fiscal year, the minister shall not table a budget in the House of Assembly that estimates a deficit for the province for the fiscal year in which the budget relates. So basically what this sets out is the balanced budget legislation that we cannot run a deficit. And as of this point in time, because this bill, Bill 29, has not passed through the House, the estimates, of course, that we passed prior to this puts the government in an illegal position because that act has not been repealed yet. And I know during question period, the minister said, well, bring us to court on it. Well, we're not going to bring it to court, but because this is the court of public opinion, the court of the opposition, is simply that we are in a legal position today. And I'm sure by supper time or whatever time we get to vote on this budget, it will correct that issue. But I needed to underline for the next number of hours, we will be in a legal position when it comes to the Provincial Finance Act. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to number 28, and it says, or 28.1, which is clauses 76A, bracket 1, bracket E, and F of Chapter 365 are repealed. So if we look quickly at what that one does for us, it's a quite long one, Mr. Speaker. One, the annual revenue in an amount not to exceed that as set out for each year below, which would otherwise be recognized under generally accepted accounting principles, with respect to the receipt of an offshore payment in each year, as a result of an arrangement between the Government of Canada and the provinces on offshore revenue, shall not be recognized for the purposes of Sections 76, 77, and 78. So basically, this is the very piece. Maybe the phrasing is a little bit different from what was presented back in May. But this is the very piece that party defeated our government. So at that time, it was wrong for some reason. It was wrong. Mr. Speaker, we would be presenting, I think, what was reasonable and using dollars that are available to us to operate the province, to provide the services that are needed in the province, whether it be in healthcare, whether it be in roads, whether it be in education. And our idea was to use those dollars for a short period of time until the fiscal realities righted themselves again. And I could go through, it basically lists on 0506 the dollars up to 1011 to how many dollars would be used towards debt. The second piece, which is the annual revenue in an amount equal to no more than $830 million, less the sum of all annual expenses not recognized under subsection 1, which would be otherwise recognized in the fiscal year 11-12 under generally accepted accounting principles with respect to the receipt of an offshore payment as a result of the arrangement between Government of Canada and the provinces on offshore revenues, shall not be recognized for the purposes of Section 76, 77, and 78. So the point here is that in May, we weren't allowed to do this. It was an illegal act. It was awful. Yet today, we have this government doing the very, very same thing. Mr. Speaker, again, number 29 is Section 78 of Chapter 365, is repealed. And that's the recovery of deficit. And it reads something like this. Well, exactly like this. 1, subject to subsection 2, a deficit in a fiscal year shall be recovered no later than the end of fiscal year next following in the year in which the deficit occurred. Where a deficit occurs in a fiscal year as a result of an expenditure required for the fiscal year because of a natural or other disaster of the province that could not have been anticipated and that affects the province or a region of the province in a manner that is of urgent public concern. B, losses associated with sale, dissolution, closure, and other restructuring of a government unit or government business enterprise that are not anticipated to have a similar financial impact on the future fiscal years. Or C, an expense incurred with respect to debt servicing costs that exceed the amount budgeted for debt servicing costs for more than a fiscal year. The deficit is not required to be recovered. So in essence, that should, towards the end of a year, that something happens within that year, that there is a deficit incurred. You know, Hurricane Juan was a good example where a lot of dollars would have had to go out to fix the damage that Hurricane Juan. But had that number been a large number and we would not have been in a positive situation, we would have been able to say, well, listen, because of that, we're going to be posting a deficit at year end. But that's being taken out as well. And I could go on of the different, but these are the very specific changes to the Provincial Finance Act that we have to oppose in this particular case. You know, the wholesale allowing this government to run a deficit for infinitum, you know, there is no plan here to get us back into deficit. And I know the minister will try his best, and I know his premier has been speaking on a number of occasions and saying that we will live within our means. But there's no written commitment here. There's no, you know, we're in a pretty gray area of when the province will come back into balance, which was a commitment that our government made back in '99, that we will be back in balance within 3 years and would stay in a balanced situation that day forward. So we're looking for maybe some more clarity on that as time goes on. And I think, Mr. Speaker, that's where, you know, test number 2 will come into play. You know, when this government truly has their opportunity to present their own budget. You know, apparently this is ours, and I've said it on a number of occasions, and our leader said it on a number of occasions. Our Liberal Party has said the same thing. You know, as a matter of fact, I thank them for their comments on that. Of course, our relationship seems to be a sort of a teenage love affair where sometimes we're on and sometimes we're off. So Mr. Speaker, so right now is that we can stand here and agree as well that this is not the budget that I sat on a number of hours and days in the cabinet room trying to find a solution. Mr. Speaker, you know, we made some conscious decisions, you know, in the view of a balanced budget, of not funding some issues. And you know what they'll find over the next number of months as they start putting their budget together, their budget number 2 together, they'll have some hard decisions to make. You know, I know the Minister of Agriculture and Minister of Department of Natural Resources will have many community groups, organizations, farmers, what have you, coming to him saying, we need more dollars for this or that project. And they'll be valuable projects. I know that the Minister of Education, you know, through work with the schools and the public school system or the university school system, called the community college, will have some wonderful projects presented by them that they're going to have to consider into their next budget. And I know every other minister will have that conflict as well. But the Minister of Finance and the Premier are going to have to say no in some cases, or the Minister of Treasury are going to have to say no. And I hope in some case that they take that in. I mean, there are some wonderful programs presented by different groups in this province. But will they have the capability to live within their means with all of those projects being presented to them? I don't know. But that's going to be test number 2. Mr. Speaker, let's go back a little bit to some of the things that we're seeing within the Provincial Finance Act. You know, again, they will be able to table this deficit. So, you know, like I said, by supper time, we'll be legal again. We'll be legal again. Mr. Speaker, the offshore offset issue that they spoke so much against will become a reality. Mr. Speaker, they'll no longer have to recover that deficit. Again, that recovery of deficit issue is a very precarious position that they put themselves in. Because what Department of Health does to their DHAs, and I believe the Department of Education does to the school boards, is that those organizations are not allowed to run a deficit. So on one side, they're saying it's okay for us, but it's not okay for you. And if you do run the deficit, you're going to have to pay it back next year. They don't have to do it again either. So living within our means is sort of a dangerous issue here, because they're not going to live within their means this year, and they're going to ask the DHAs and the school boards to do the same thing, to have to live within their means. You know, a lot of things can be triggered here, and I hope they're not. I mean, I hope they're not, because Mr. Speaker, we would expect as a Conservative party, as a progressive Conservative party, is to live within our means as well, to be able to react to the needs of the province as they come, but to be able to post another positive budget. Mr. Speaker, we know that this is a tough economic time, and it was one that's very hard to pin down. And I know over the last number of weeks that the Minister of Finance, I'm sure, has seen conflicting numbers and has seen numbers erode again. Mr. Speaker, I can say that we always tended to scratch our heads and hide when Department of Finance would come knocking on the door of Cabinet again and say, well, the numbers that we presented to you last week probably aren't as good this week. Or the federal government is divided with this, or not going to do that. So there's going to be a lot of work that is going to have to be looked at and done. And we all sit here and you know, we're here to criticize in a lot of cases. We're here to work with on a lot of other cases. But I want to sincerely say this, is that, you know, I wish the Minister of Finance well going into his second budget, because it's going to be a lot of work. And I hope that everybody sitting around him supports him in some of the very difficult decisions that he's going to have to make in order to meet up with the commitment that that party made during the election. Well, that was in June. But I can say that just like a lot of these other statements within their book, that I don't have a lot of hope that they're actually going to be fulfilled. We haven't seen a lot of fulfillment on them already. You know, we're still waiting. You know, 124 days have gone by already.
Come on, Maureen.
So we're waiting.
Come on, Maureen.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Minister of Health for piping up there a little bit. You know, there are a number of programs within her department that need tweaking. The caregivers allowance program is one of them. In order to do that, maybe she's going to need a little more money on that one.
She'll do it.
You have to be reactive as a government. You have to be able to make changes as they come at you. So again, I'm going to go back to some of my original statements is, you know, the time for blame is over. Time for pointing at you is over. This isn't our budget. Our budget was balanced. And Mr. Speaker, I look forward to discussing this one further. I know there are a number of other people that are looking to comment on this, and I'll allow them that time now. And I thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to the Provincial Finance Act, or actually the Financial Measures Act, which is Bill number 29. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very pleased to be able to say a few words today on the Financial Measures Act, which we're looking at. As the finance minister knows, of course, we had been finance critics together on this side of the House, and I've had many opportunities to listen to him asking very good questions and setting a very high tone in terms of the finances of the province and where we should be going. So it is very interesting for me today to be here and look at the details of the Financial Measures Act and hear the minister's explanations for some of the changes that we're about to see. I just feel it's very important for all members of the House to pay a great deal of attention as the budget goes through. This is, in fact, Mr. Speaker, I would say the most important vote of any year that we look at. And of course, once a year we do examine a budget and set basically set the course for this province. And every single department that any one of us has a great interest in is going to be dictated by the budget that we see before us today. And that's why the decisions that are made and the foundation on which our province is built is so important financially. Now, I think all of us knew about the declining revenues that this province was going to feel this year. There was no secret to the fact that the oil revenues were off tremendously. Last year, Mr. Speaker, when I was finance critic, we were looking at, and I think we actually received in the realm of $500 million in offshore royalties because of the amount of natural gas that was flowing from our shores and being pumped. That was a tremendous benefit to this province, that $500 million. It had grown just in a few short years from less than $100 million. So it really made a difference to the programs and services that the province was able to afford. And we did not set aside any money during that time. It was a time of rising revenues, not only from the offshore royalties, but also from a buoyant economy at the time. We had rising income tax and rising corporate taxes. And the Conservative government for those 9 years benefited greatly from that. And they did not set aside funds. They did run a balanced budget, however. But they were able to expand programs, and they kept spending because there was enough extra money coming in. But my point really, Mr. Speaker, is that during the election just passed, only 4 months passed, we all knew that those revenues had already declined and that we were going to be facing a much more difficult year. And what disturbs me, Mr. Speaker, is that during that election, the NDP in their platform said they would run balanced budgets, said how fiscally conservative they were, how fiscally sound they were, went to great lengths and great pains to promise the people of Nova Scotia that that was the case. And Mr. Speaker, it is such a parallel to what we heard a year ago in this country when the Conservatives federally ran and promised that there would be no deficits and that they had everything under control. And we saw within weeks of them winning the election in October a year ago, how they were bringing in deficits and how now those have ballooned to something that's astronomical, really, on a national scale. And it just seems to be so self-serving to pick one stance and to say one thing during an election, Mr. Speaker. And certainly I know that our leader in the Liberal Party did speak up and say that it was absolutely clear that there would be a deficit this year, regardless of who was governing, because of the difficult times we were facing. Because, there are so many essential services that we have to provide, and nobody in this House wants to see those services impaired in any way. I know I'm the health critic now, and it's important to me to see that we are able to meet our health needs and provide for the people of Nova Scotia. So it is a difficult job to govern. I have no doubt about it. It's often putting you in difficult positions to meet demands and meet the needs of people, which is really why we're here, and also to manage the money of this province, because all of us pay our taxes. All Nova Scotians are contributing, whether it's through things they buy or their own businesses that they've established. But, Mr. Speaker, while we look at the Financial Measures Act, there's a few things. I think I've pointed out the hypocrisy of the election, the fact that really it was predicated on the idea that there would be no deficit, and that was completely ludicrous. In fact, there's a word that the Finance Minister often uses, and that's absurd. He likes to say certain things are absurd. I think that is a little bit absurd to have thought that we ever would not have had a deficit this year. However, Mr. Speaker, there are choices. I have been listening, indeed. There are choices that we make in crafting a budget. Any government does, and this government is no different. And they have made some choices that I would disagree with. and where the word absurd comes in particularly well is in trying to find a difference between the finance minister's description of why we're making 2 years payment in one to the universities, why we're paying a bill in advance of when it's due to our universities under the memorandum of understanding that we have in place that had been negotiated with all of the universities. That was to provide them with some stability in terms of understanding what they would receive from year to year, allowing them to be more effective and efficient in what they could do on their own campuses and for their students. That was a good thing, and we supported that at the time. But now the government has chosen to make a single payment to the universities to what they describe as kind of buying out the memorandum of understanding, finishing with it, and being able to start fresh when they craft another budget next year. But, Mr. Speaker, it just doesn't hold any water when we tried to listen carefully and see how that actually differs from what the Conservatives were proposing in the budget in May that they presented. That was never passed, by the way, Mr. Speaker. So I cannot, for the life of me, see a fundamental difference. The outcome is exactly the same. And the difficulty we have here is that the extra payment to the universities has actually ballooned our debt considerably. It has left us with a debt this year of $592 million, as has been said it's actually a deficit adding to the debt. I should be careful of my terminology, but that's actually, more than $500 million increase in our debt is what it will amount to, because we're spending that much more than we're going to collect in terms of our best estimates. And Mr. Speaker, I just find that is unnecessary. It's unnecessarily expanded by making this early payment to the universities, and certainly I don't believe that it was the right choice to make. I think it's been done to make this year's budget that much larger, deficit that much larger, so that next year may look better. You've postponed a payment in the next year so that it will ultimately, paint a much rosier picture, hopefully, when we meet next spring to look at the budget for 2010-11. But, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians are not stupid. Nova Scotians can understand this. Although this a lot of times looks kind of obscure and like high finance, it really isn't. It's pretty simple. Any company, anybody who's run a business, and there are people in this House that have run businesses, anybody knows that the way to operate in a time when cash is tight is that you try to extend your payables. You don't pay them quickly. You try to extend them as long as you can before you make that payment. And that's the way for you to have more cash flow and to operate more effectively. And all businesses do that, Mr. Speaker. But I guess this government is not going to operate under those principles. They're going to make an early payment for no apparent reason except political optics, to look better, so that they themselves will look better. I disagree with that, Mr. Speaker, and I think it was important to get up and say so today. So, Mr. Speaker, in terms of looking at this, the Financial Measures Act has really a lot of small changes, a lot of increased fees. So that's pretty much standard in these acts each year. There's cost of living increases, which we understand, and some of them are described simply as increases. So they obviously cannot be tied directly to the cost of living. There's also some increased taxes. They're very clear. They say it's a tax, not otherwise. We're looking at changes to the Companies Act and the Corporations Registration Act, lots of different fees going up there, and an increase in tobacco, which we had all agreed to. So that's fine. Those smaller details we do understand. Other choices, though, that the government made would be, for example, the equity tax credit, where they've chosen to use that as a tool to stimulate business. And I think only time will tell whether that really will make a fundamental difference. But for the costs that the minister outlined to do that, I think he said it would be about another $1 million to help them. I think there are other ways that we could have addressed some of the needs of small business. And in fact, in our own budget, or in our own platform during the election, the Liberal Party had gone the route of looking at small business, Mr. Speaker, because the majority of companies in this province, in fact, the vast majority, are small business, and there isn't one community that doesn't have small business people operating there. And so, as our leader had said earlier, we believe that it would have been more effective to lower the small business tax. But that being said, those are choices that people are making. My big concern really is around the changes to the Provincial Finance Act. And I wanted to just reference briefly, and I am conscious of the time, Mr. Speaker, but I did want to reference the changes that we saw in the 6 years that I've been here in the legislature. In that time, certainly we did see the agreement signed for the offshore accord, which brought $800 million, a little bit more $1 million to this province. And what was interesting was the way that that came about. Certainly it was a long-standing dispute with the federal government, and it was a great success for this province that we were able to get that amount of money brought to the province. But Mr. Speaker, if we're going to use that money that was hard fought and negotiated and frankly we were entitled to, if we're going to take that money that was definitely an exceptional windfall to this province and now allow it to go directly onto the programs and services that we're receiving, then we have squandered a tremendous opportunity to lower the debt and take that noose a little bit, loosen the noose around our necks. And there's been a lot said here in the House today, Mr. Speaker, about the next generation, about our children and about our grandchildren, and whether or not they'll be saddled with our inflated deficits that we've run up over our lifetime. And that is exactly what I'm concerned about as well. When we saw that $800 million come to the province, I know that here in the House we asked questions of then Premier Ham, and we asked questions of the Finance Minister, and I remember having discussions with them at various opportunities, whether it was here in the House or elsewhere, saying you really have to take that special payment and make sure it goes against our debt so we can have some light at the end of the tunnel. Mr. Speaker, where is the light at the end of the tunnel when our debt now is growing by another $500 million this year? We knew we were in good years at the time when our revenues were growing, and we needed to stay the course and take that money and put it against the debt. That just, to me, was just a fundamental principle that we had to do. And now we are going into this year, and it looks like at least one more year of using that money. What I heard from the Finance Minister in his opening comments was that it'll be at least 2 years before we see a recovery in our revenues, which means our economy bouncing back, more people working, hopefully an increase in offshore petroleum costs so that we can get more royalties. But we know it's going to be a few years, Mr. Speaker, and I feel that here we are actually sitting here and watching the legacy that John Ham did establish, and I was very pleased when he did make the decision to see that money went on the debt. That was just an important decision for this province. And now we have reversed that, and that is what is included in these clauses 27, 28, 29. I guess 27 is doing it directly by saying now that we're allowed to have a budget deficit. That's number one. 28 saying that we can take the offshore offset monies, the revenues, and use them towards our programs, that we no longer have to keep them for debt reduction. And Mr. Speaker, I agree with, I think, something that the Finance Minister said, something about it being kind of obscure and difficult or something to work with. Confusing, I think, was the word he used. But in fact, the accounting for that offshore offset was somewhat confusing because we had to maintain a surplus each year equal to the amount that we received or recognized as the amount that we were getting. And Mr. Speaker, if I seem to be a little bit passionate about this, I suppose it's because I've studied some accounting, and most people do not find that very interesting, but I do, in fact. And at the time, I thought it was an unusual mechanism that we had to use, but that seemed to be the way the Department of Finance wants to and felt that the offshore offset had to be recognized, and that actually follows the principles of GAAP that we've talked about here today, the generally accepted accounting principles, which we were moving towards and have been moving towards since the 1990s, when the Liberal government wrestled with a terrible situation and tried to bring a semblance of professionalism to the way we managed our province financially. And we did take the first difficult steps towards generally accepted accounting principles. And so that being said, Mr. Speaker, we had the money separately identified year by year, because that $800 million had to be recognized over a period of years. It recognizes is the royalties and the money that comes from our offshore resources annually. And for that reason, you know, it was very important to do it. It may have been difficult for the Department of Finance, but we have to recognize that that was a legacy to our province, a legacy to our children and grandchildren, and a means to take that, that tremendous burden of debt and just alleviate it a little bit as we go forward. And so I'm very disappointed, Mr. Speaker, to see that that has just been thrown out the window. Again, even if we were to look at it as a one-time event, so that we know that every year there would be tremendous efforts made to respect that money going towards the debt. If we felt that this year was an extraordinary circumstance, then I would say by all means, Mr. Speaker, we should indeed have you know, discussed that here in the House and recognize the difficult situation the government is in. But we haven't been asked to do that. We've been asked to throw out the balanced budget legislation and to throw out the commitment that was made to pay down our debt with the offshore revenues that we have. You know, it's important to mention it's a non-renewable resource. And the government knows this well, Mr. Speaker. They know that as the gas is extracted, we can't replace that. So it is an opportunity for us that we are just seeing squandered here today as we go forward. And, you know, again, and I think every Nova Scotian should be upset to see over $500 million in this year's deficit. Mr. Speaker, there's a number of smaller programs that are touched on in this. I've talked about the university funding, which is a major additional expense, which it's more than doubling the deficit that we would be seeing, and the fact that that was a deliberate choice, a deliberate political choice of this government, and there is no other way to look at that. I just believe that we should be trying to be as honest in our accounting and as fiscally responsible as a company would be, or as anybody in business would be in terms of how we manage that. And that's not what we're seeing here today. Again, I point out, Mr. Speaker, that during the election there were a lot of promises made that weren't, you know, we're not seeing it here today. And in fact, the promise to maintain balanced budgets was absurd. It was ludicrous. No question about it. And, you know, it doesn't show fortitude that immediately we've thrown that right out the window. You know, I think when we're being unrealistic, it's not fair to the people of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, the choice about reducing the HST off of electricity is another interesting point. Much smaller amounts of money we're talking about here. But I still think it's very important to know what was going on. Here in the House, we discussed at great length for years while the NDP were in opposition about taking HST off of home heating and the fact that we live in a northern climate that's very cold. And the Conservatives actually bungled it. Mr. Speaker, they bungled it because they took it off of all electricity. Not just off of not just the heating portion of electricity, but they took HST off of all the electricity while they took it off of home heating fuel and wood and other means of heating our homes. And then they realized the cost and they backtracked and they changed the formula for electricity so that the HST would only come off of the portion that they could somehow attribute to the amount we heat with. Well, Mr. Speaker, my house is heated with electricity, and I know that they had to use a formula that would say, how much extra do I pay because that's my heating source as well as my source for all other electricity. But having done so, there was a backlash from the NDP, and then they ran in the election on the idea of taking HST off of all electricity. But that was not the issue at hand. The issue at hand for this House had been to help people stay warm. And to go back to this you know, importance, the Keep the Heat program for people who didn't have enough money to heat their homes, and to just respect that portion. But we've gone beyond that. Now every bit of electricity in the province is now going to be subsidized because we're taking the taxes off of the electricity, the provincial portion of the taxes. This year alone, Mr. Speaker, that's costing $15 million, and next year it will be $30 million when a whole year is factored in.
Increased consumption.
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, the trouble with this, and I've had the difficulty of discussing this on doorsteps, because everybody likes more money in their pocket. Everybody does, whether you're wealthy or middle class, it makes no difference. If you're needy, everybody wants to have a little more money that they keep that doesn't go to taxes. But Mr. Speaker, we have to think where the need is greatest. And the need is greatest with those people who simply can't afford to fill their oil tanks. That's where we need to be spending $15 million. And the average benefit for somebody who is low income or you know, perhaps far below the poverty line, they won't see much benefit because they're keeping their heat down, they're using the least amount of oil they can possibly use or the least amount of electricity. They are trying desperately to conserve because they can't afford the first kilowatt hour. They can't afford it as they go forward. So that saving the tax on it is a very small amount for them. But those people who have larger homes or are heating cottages or bigger properties, I guess you can't do your cottage, but if you had a great big house and it had all kinds of ancillary things like swimming pools or double garages or triple garages, whatever, those do. They're not all in the South End. They're not all in the South End. But really and truly, Mr. Speaker, it has to be said that there's a bit of hypocrisy here about the better deal because, you know, we're giving a deal in that case to people who really are quite comfortable and will have their homes heated regardless, and they're going to have their lights on regardless. And as we've said before, every member of this chamber, every member of the legislature will get and enjoy this benefit. My electricity bill has gone down as a result, as everybody else's has, and yet we are not the people who need it most. The people who need it most are the people on those low incomes, below the poverty line, and they've relied on something that, like the Keep the Heat program, where the government would send out a check and help you actually get the oil that you need or make that purchase. Now, Mr. Speaker, you know this year that program is going to be significantly cut. And it's true, it's because there are choices to be made. We can't give $15 million in benefit, taking revenue out of our province of $15 million, because we've now forgiven it, and then still find money to make the programs for low-income Nova Scotians. So it's a clear example of a choice and a policy that seems absolutely counter to the values of the New Democratic Party that we hear about and that we know people feel strongly about. It just seems to fly in the face of those values. So that's why on this side of the House it's very difficult, Mr. Speaker, for us not to say that there's an element of hypocrisy or that government somehow completely changes your perspective. Because for years and years, toiling in the hinterland, the NDP promised certain things, and they said they stood for certain things. And now the reality of governing is you know, obviously very quickly staring them in the face. And, Mr. Speaker, they have to make choices. But I don't see them adhering to those early principles. And I think it's because they began to sell out when they were on this side looking for votes from middle-class and higher-income Nova Scotians and thinking that government themselves could give a better deal to everybody. And that's just not possible, Mr. Speaker. We have to ask people to be resilient, and we have to say we have people that need help, and we have others that stand on their own 2 feet. And that's what I think is important that we say, and it's not easy to say when you're a politician and you want to help everybody. It's not. And, Mr. Speaker, I think that on our part, the Liberal Party took a very difficult stance because we did campaign on helping those who need help the most. And that's not easy to do. We did it because we have principles. And, you know, and I think that's worth saying, you know, again and again. We also are concerned about the environmental impact. If there's less cost to heating your home and to burning fossil fuels, well, we'll be doing more of it because people are very much driven in their decisions by economics. And we know that. That's why countries in Europe charge so much more for gasoline or for any kind of fossil fuel. It's because they understand that connection. We obviously haven't gotten there at all, Mr. Speaker. We don't have the environmental integrity to stand up and measure these kind of decisions and these kind of public policy decisions against what is really right. So, Mr. Speaker, that again is here in the bill before us. We get to see how that decision was made. Mr. Speaker, in terms of living within our means, I heard the minister say that, and it's really important that he said that there's no question he was going to adhere to this abiding commitment, is actually what he said, and he has an abiding commitment to live within our means. Well, Mr. Speaker, to begin with, in this first year of the NDP government, in this first budget that they have introduced, we are not living within our means. So let's not be fooled by saying the right thing and then doing something completely different. This year, for whatever reason, perhaps it was virtually impossible, but we are not living within our means. We're running up a half billion dollar deficit, and that needs to be spoken clearly and plainly here in the House. And Mr. Speaker, I know there are decisions to be made in the future as well about many other programs and taxes, but you know, as a start, we shouldn't be cutting our own or making it more difficult by cutting taxes that really don't benefit those who need it the most. And I think that, again, I go back to it being self-serving. I think we should be trying to make a more business-friendly environment. And, Mr. Speaker, the minister spoke about creating jobs and growing the economy. And certainly, if you look at the very simple formula of government, I mean, you have so much revenue. You have a lot of obligations. The only thing you can do is look at how can you grow that revenue. And certainly by expanding business, that's a lot more attractive than by increasing taxes. So we want to support the business community, and I think that that is the way to go, by creating some more programs and policies that way. Mr. Speaker, there are small things the government could do to show that they're different. One of them might be right away to look at some of the questions around small business that come forward. And one of the very small issues that has been mentioned, which has an impact on business, is our liquor laws and how we treat things like brewing on premises companies. We have a completely old-fashioned view of that, and the current government hasn't seemed to have changed their mind on it. They've been approached, and the people have talked to them, and we're getting the same answer. In fact, we're getting the bureaucrats' answer. So I'm hoping, and I'll say in my few words on the Financial Measures Act, I'm hoping that the new government will challenge, you know, some of the prevailing biases that are within the bureaucracy, and challenge some of these positions that just don't make sense. And Mr. Speaker, I'd like to allow other members to have a few words on the Financial Measures Act. So what I would simply say is that we need to be clear that this budget that this Financial Measures Act, which enables the budget, is actually laying down the foundation for a huge deficit, and it's cancelling some of the gains that we've made in previous years by setting a strong legislative foundation for good financial management. By throwing out some of the earlier acts and amending them, we are losing the legacy of a requirement for balanced budgets and a requirement for spending our offshore money on our debt. And those are two of the major